On the morning of April 12, 2009, during the historic spring thaw in Cass County, North Dakota, a $750,000 piece of heavy industrial equipment was actively sinking into the earth. It was a Gefco 30K rotary drilling rig mounted on a massive tandem axle chassis, weighing exactly 70,000 pounds. The commercial drilling outfit had been contracted to sink emergency relief wells to combat the rising floodwaters of the Red River. But the soil of the Red River Valley is notorious. It is heavy, alkaline, glacial lakebed clay known to locals as gumbo, a substance that turns into bottomless, black glue when saturated. The drilling operator had backed too close to the shoulder of a compromised access road, the crust had sheared off, and the entire rig had slid sideways into the ditch, burying its rear axles and leveling jacks deep into the muck. Now, standing on the solid asphalt of the highway, was the lead operator of a regional heavy-duty towing company. He had brought an overwhelming display of modern force, 4-century 1,140 rotator wreckers, each boasting 50 tons of winch capacity and 500 horsepower diesel engines. The 4 massive tow trucks were lined up side by side, their thick steel cables running down into the ditch attached to the frame of the sunken drill rig. At 9:15 a.m., the lead operator gave the signal. All 4 diesel engines roared in unison. The massive outriggers dug into the asphalt. The steel cables stretched, vibrating violently under the strain of 200 combined tons of hydraulic pulling force. But the earth didn't yield. The drilling rig groaned, physically pulling the 4 wreckers backward, dragging their locked tires across the pavement. And then, a deep, rhythmic, hissing whistle cut through the roar of the diesels. Creeping slowly down the highway, trailing a thick plume of black coal smoke, was a weathered lowboy trailer. Sitting on the deck was an 89-year-old retired farmer named Arthur Pendelton, steering a 1,920-case, 110 steam traction engine. The lead wrecker operator wiped his brow, looked at the hissing 12-foot-tall iron relic, and let out a tired, dismissive laugh. The state's best recovery crew was losing a war to the mud, and a man had showed up with a parade float to help. The lead wrecker operator wasn't a fool. He was an incredibly skilled professional who handled highway rollovers and overturned cement mixers every week. He understood gross vehicle weight, drag coefficients, and hydraulic multiplication. He looked at the antique Case 110 steam engine and saw exactly 32 horsepower at the drawbar. To a modern mechanic, trying to pull a 70,000-pound rig trapped in suction with 32 horsepower was a mathematical joke. But internal combustion horsepower and steam horsepower are not measured by the same laws of physics. When they met an immovable object like the Red River gumbo, that rotational energy had to go somewhere. It either spun the tires, slipped the transmission, or violently snapped the cables. Steam engines operate on a completely different paradigm. The single, massive cylinder of Arthur Pendelton's 1,920 case engine emitted high-pressure steam directly against a heavy piston. When that steam expands, it delivers its absolute maximum twisting force, its peak torque, at exactly 0 revolutions per minute. It doesn't need momentum. It doesn't need to spin. It simply begins to lean its massive iron weight against the earth with continuous, unbroken, infinite pressure. If you've been watching, you already know where this is going, or maybe you don't. Have you ever operated a machine that delivers its absolute maximum torque at 0 RPM? I want to hear about it in the comments. And if you're new here and wondering what kind of channel this is, even if you've never stood beside a massive steam boiler, you know what it feels like to watch someone with $1 million budget surrender to a problem that a man with nothing to lose could solve. Stick around. Because the engineering behind early 20th century steam power remains one of the most misunderstood chapters in mechanical history, and we're not done yet. But before Arthur could prove it, the modern fleet had to fail. At 10:30 a.m., the wrecker crews decided they couldn't just lean on the drill rig, they had to snatch it. They rigged massive, ultra-heavy-duty nylon kinetic recovery ropes between their steel winch lines and the drilling rig's frame. Kinetic ropes are an incredible modern invention. They stretch up to 30% of their length, storing massive amounts of kinetic energy before snapping back to their original size with explosive, violent force. It is a technique designed to literally shock a trapped vehicle out of the mud. But the heavy, alkaline gumbo of the Red River Valley does not obey the physics of normal dirt. When wet, it acts as a perfect vacuum sealant against flat steel surfaces. The drilling rig wasn't just stuck, it was hermetically sealed to the earth. Engineers understand that deep mud stiction can effectively triple the dead weight of a vehicle. The wreckers weren't pulling 35 tons, they were fighting over 100 tons of atmospheric vacuum. The 4 tow trucks backed up to create slack, threw their transmissions into gear, and hit the throttles. The massive diesels screamed. The nylon ropes stretched until they were thin, terrifyingly tight bands of white fiber, and then the physics of the vacuum won. The heavy steel D-ring on the lead wrecker's winch cable could not withstand the multi-ton explosive strain. It snapped with the deafening crack of a cannon shot. The kinetic rope violently unstretched, whipping back toward the ditch like a scythe, completely shattering the fiberglass body panels of the Gefco rig and burying itself deep into the mud bank. The entire fleet immediately shut down. The air was dead silent, save for the hissing of Arthur's steam boiler. Modern explosive force had utterly failed. The lead operator pulled off his hard hat and threw it onto the dashboard of his wrecker. He was preparing to call the county to ask for a heavy lift crawler crane, a process that would cost the drilling company nearly $20,000 in mobilization fees. That was when Arthur Pendelton slowly climbed down from the cab of his truck. He didn't walk fast. He was 89 years old, moving with the stiff, deliberate gait of a man who had spent 7 decades fighting the North Dakota winters. He walked past the massive, idle tow trucks, looked down at the shattered fiberglass of the drilling rig, and then looked at the mud. "You're pulling too fast," Arthur said, his voice raspy but steady. "You're trying to scare the gumbo. Gumbo doesn't scare." The wrecker boss wiped his hands on an oil rag and sighed. "With all due respect, Pop," the operator said, exhausted. "We just put 200,000 pounds of kinetic snatch on that rig and ripped our own gear to pieces. That mud has a complete vacuum seal on the chassis. Your parade float back there has 30 horsepower. You couldn't pull a sick dog off a porch with that." Arthur didn't get angry. He had lived through the 1980s farm crisis. He knew what happened to men who thought aggressive speed could conquer nature. He simply turned back toward his lowboy trailer. "I'm not going to snatch it," Arthur said quietly over his shoulder. "I'm going to lean on it." What the wrecker crew didn't know was that the massive 1,920 case wasn't just heavy. It was built specifically for breaking virgin prairie sod, a task that required unrelenting, unbreakable tension. Arthur slowly backed the massive case 110 off the trailer. The earth literally shook as the 34,000-pound iron behemoth found the pavement. The massive cleats of its drive wheels cracked the thin layer of ice left from the night before. He didn't park on the shoulder. He drove the steam engine to the absolute center of the dry highway, aligning his heavy cast-iron drawbar perfectly straight with the rear of the sunken drill rig. He wasn't going to use kinetic nylon. He pulled heavy canvas bags from his truck. Inside were lengths of antique 1-inch thick grade 80 forged iron log chain. Arthur didn't have block and tackle pulleys, and he didn't need them. He was going to rely on a direct, straight-line pull. He shackle-pinned the heavy iron chain to the drilling rig's solid steel frame, dragged it up the embankment, and dropped a massive steel pin through the drawbar of the steam engine. The setup was brutal in its simplicity. Iron chain does not stretch. It has zero kinetic forgiveness. When you pull an iron chain tight, every single ounce of force is transferred directly into the load. If the load does not move, the chain will either break or the machine pulling it will tear its own gears apart. The wrecker operators stood on the white line of the highway, arms crossed. They were absolutely certain the old man was going to scatter antique cast iron transmission parts all over the asphalt. At 11:15 a.m., Arthur climbed the iron ladder onto the operator's platform. He checked the sight glass on his boiler. The water was perfect. He looked at the steam pressure gauge. Could century-old steel withstand a dead pull against the earth? Arthur reached up and pulled a heavy iron lever, opening the cylinder cocks. A massive geyser of pure white steam and boiling water shot out from the sides of the single cylinder with a deafening hiss, blowing out the condensation. The engine was hot, clean, and carrying exactly 150 pounds of pressure. Arthur looked back at the drilling rig. He didn't slam the tractor into gear. A steam engine uses a massive friction clutch, engaging the engine to the drive wheels using immense physical pressure against wooden or fibrous blocks. Arthur reached over to the heavy clutch lever. He pulled it with the agonizing slowness of a man threading a needle. The heavy cast-iron gears began to turn. The massive iron chain lying on the asphalt began to rise. It didn't snap taut. It tightened link by massive link, groaning under the incredible strain. The line went perfectly rigid, a solid bar of iron connecting 1920 to 2009. The wrecker operators flinched, waiting for the chain to shatter. But Arthur didn't pull fast. He engaged the clutch just enough to hold the tension and opened the steam throttle a fraction of an inch. The massive single cylinder accepted the steam. The immense rear wheels of the Case 110 leaned into the asphalt. The tractor stopped moving forward. The iron cleats dug into the road. The massive flywheel kept turning, slipping the clutch exactly as Arthur intended. He was applying 32 horsepower of infinite, continuous, 0 RPM torque against the vacuum seal of the gumbo. The massive steam engine groaned, the exhaust chuffing a slow, heavy staccato beat into the cold air. Chuff, chuff, chuff. Arthur just stood there, smelling burning coal, holding the tension perfectly constant. If you pull fast, the mud acts like a solid wall. If you pull constantly, what eventually happens to the vacuum? For 9 terrifying minutes, the 1,920 Case 110 stood perfectly still on the highway, vibrating under pressure. The chain remained tight as a bowstring. Nothing moved. But down in the ditch, the continuous, unrelenting tension was doing exactly what Arthur intended. By pulling constantly without jerking, he was giving the water and air in the saturated gumbo time to seep into the vacuum pocket beneath the drilling rig's massive leveling jacks. At exactly 11:27 a.m., a wet, deep, heavy sucking noise echoed out of the ditch. It sounded like the earth itself taking a massive breath. The lead wrecker operator dropped his arms. Down in the mud, the black clay around the Gefco rig began to bubble and separate. The stiction was failing. The 70,000-pound drilling rig, dead weight in the clay, shifted forward half an inch. The steam engine didn't change its pitch. Arthur maintained the exact same clutch slip, letting the steam lean into the newly created space. Another wet gasp from the mud, and the modern machine moved 2 inches, then 4. The heavy iron chain held true. Arthur steered the massive case forward at a glacial pace, less than 1 mile an hour. The 70,000-pound machine was dragged out of its grave, plowing through the thick gumbo, moving steadily up the side of the embankment. The wrecker crews stood in complete silence. They were watching a master class in physics defeat a problem that 2,000 horsepower of modern diesel could not. But dragging a rig out of a ditch is one thing. What happens when the job is done and the fire is still burning? By noon, the massive drilling rig was resting safely on the center line of the highway, coated in thick black mud but entirely free. Arthur idled the steam engine down, pulled the clutch lever to neutral, and unpinned the heavy iron chain. The lead wrecker operator walked over to the towering iron machine. The arrogance was completely gone from his voice. "I owe you a massive apology, sir," the operator said, extending his hand. "I didn't think that old boiler had the power to do it. What's your recovery rate?" Arthur climbed down the iron ladder and shook the man's hand. He didn't gloat. "No charge," Arthur replied, wiping grease from his gloves. "But don't go thinking this old iron is magic. If you had to drive this rig across the county to a new job site, my engine would take 3 days to do what your tow trucks do in an hour. This tractor is too slow for modern highway work. It maxes out at barely 2 miles an hour, it needs hundreds of gallons of water, and it burns coal by the ton. It's a logistical nightmare." He patted the warm steel of the water tank. "Your trucks are better for 99% of the jobs you do, but not this job. Because when you get stuck in the deep dark, you don't need kinetic speed. You need continuous, infinite leverage. Your machines were built to force an outcome. This machine was built to negotiate one. And the gumbo doesn't respond to force." The wrecker operators helped Arthur load the massive iron chain back into his canvas bags. They were quiet. Their perspective fundamentally shifted. They watched the old farmer climb back onto the platform, treating the obsolete machine with the deep reverence it had earned. As the lead engineer drove his county truck back to the dispatch office, the radio on his dashboard was silent. He was doing a different kind of math. The Caterpillar 336F excavator they had just rescued carried a massive financial burden, likely financed on a municipal lease costing thousands of dollars every month. The engineer had just spent a terrifying morning trying to justify that massive capital investment against a wall of river mud, and the capital had almost lost. Then there was Samuel Hightower. The old farmer had driven down the road with a machine that hadn't seen a banknote since William Howard Taft was in the White House. The Case 65 steam traction engine had cost roughly $2,000 brand new in 1912. In the century since, its only carrying costs were water, coal, heavy cylinder oil, and the labor required to tend the boiler. What the engineer hadn't realized as he watched the old man patiently engage that friction clutch was that he wasn't just watching a mechanical rescue. He was watching an economic philosophy in motion. When you owe the bank thousands of dollars a month, you cannot afford to wait. You have to move fast. You have to force the ground to yield, force the project to finish, and force the extraction to happen right now, because the interest is always compounding. But when your machine is paid off, when you own your iron-free and clear, time ceases to be your enemy. You can afford to idle down. You can afford to wait for the river to breathe. You don't have to scare the earth. How did a farmer learn an economic lesson that profound? To understand why Samuel Hightower knew how to outweight the river, you have to understand the decade that forced him to learn. It was 1981, and across the American Midwest, an entire philosophy of agriculture was collapsing. For the previous 10 years, the prevailing wisdom from bankers and agricultural extensions had been simple: get big or get out. Farmers were told to leverage the equity in their land to buy massive, enclosed four-wheel drive tractors and thousands of additional acres. Debt wasn't a risk. It was considered a tool for expansion. But in the summer of 1981, the prime interest rate hit a staggering 20.5%. Simultaneously, grain exports stalled and commodity prices collapsed. The debt trap snapped shut. In Missouri, land values plummeted almost overnight. The collateral that farmers had used to borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars simply vanished on paper. Suddenly, the neighbors surrounding the Hightower farm found themselves owing more interest every month than their corn crop could possibly generate in a year. The massive new machines they had bought on credit were repossessed, towed out of driveways by the very dealerships that had sold them. The county courthouses filled with foreclosure notices. Generations of family farming history were auctioned off on front lawns to the highest bidder. But Samuel Hightower didn't lose a single acre. While his neighbors were borrowing at variable rates, Samuel was farming with older, paid-off diesel equipment and running his family's antique sawmill with the 1912 Case steam engine. His debt payment was exactly zero. When commodity prices fell, his farm did not hemorrhage cash. Why was the slow, methodical use of obsolete iron the very thing that saved his family's land? The slowness was his absolute defense, but operating a steam engine isn't a romantic, effortless endeavor. Samuel would be the first to tell you that the old iron is brutal. A 1912 Case traction engine has no cab, no suspension, and no margin for error. Operating it is not a job. It is a profound physical deployment. You don't just turn a key. You wake up at 4 a.m. to build a fire in the firebox. You shovel heavy chunks of coal for hours. You monitor the glass sight tube constantly, because if the water level drops below the crown sheet, the boiler won't just stall, it will explode with enough force to level a building. The heat radiating off the boiler jacket in the middle of a Missouri summer is suffocating. The machine takes a physical toll on a man's shoulders, his back, and his lungs. The commercial operators sitting inside their climate-controlled, air-ride, GPS-guided excavator cabs were completely insulated from this friction. They couldn't feel the earth fighting back until it was too late, until the riverbank crust broke and the mud swallowed them whole. But Samuel had to be entirely present. He had to listen to the specific hiss of the safety valve, feel the vibration of the massive gears, and negotiate constantly with the elements. That was the unseen weight Samuel brought to the river that morning in 2019. The county engineer saw a rusted antique teapot. Samuel saw the crucible that had forged his family's independence. When the tow trucks snapped their ropes, it was just the 1980s farm crisis repeating itself in miniature. A sudden violent demand for an impossible result, shattering under the reality of the earth's resistance. What happens to that kind of earned wisdom when the man who holds it is gone? Samuel Hightower knew he wouldn't live forever to pull heavy machinery out of the river. In farming communities, a patriarch's passing is usually followed by a familiar, tragic ritual, the estate auction. The auctioneer's tents go up, the land is divided, the machinery is lined up in the driveway, and neighboring corporate operations absorb the acreage. It is the final victory of the debt cycle. But there will be no auction at the Hightower farm. Because Samuel had never leveraged his land, there was no bank waiting to demand immediate liquidation to cover outstanding notes. His farm, consisting of the fertile river bottoms and the timberland on the bluff soil that had been carefully stewarded for 3 generations, is already legally transitioning to his grandson, William. William is a modern man. He understands variable rate applications, soil mapping, and modern diesel mechanics. To a corporate liquidator, the old machine shed holding the steam engine is just full of heavy, worthless scrap iron. But William grew up riding on the wooden platform of that 1912 case. He had watched his grandfather pull a $300,000 excavator out of the mud using nothing but physics and boiling water. He understood that the massive black iron boiler wasn't just obsolete farm equipment. It was the physical manifestation of the patience that had saved their family name. He didn't plan to sell the steam engine to a museum. He didn't plan to cut it up for scrap. Why would you destroy the very anchor that kept your family from washing away? Today, the Hightower farm is a thriving, quiet operation. William uses modern equipment for the bulk of his agricultural work. He isn't foolish. He knows the undeniable value of technology when it is used correctly, maintained properly, and bought responsibly. But in the back of the heavy machine shed, standing tall among the modern diesel tractors, the old iron remains. Twice a year, William opens the heavy shed doors. He hauls fresh water to the massive boiler, stacks good hardwood and coal in the bunker, and lights a fire in the firebox. He waits the hours it takes for the heavy steel to warm and the pressure to build. And the antique engine still fires up, settling into that familiar, slow, unrelenting chuffing rhythm that echoes off the wooden walls of the barn. There is a profound difference between holding on to the past because you are afraid of the future and holding on to the past because it works better than the future in the moments that actually matter. The men who built these machines understood something fundamental about the earth. It cannot be rushed. If this story meant something to you, if you grew up with a machine like this one, or if you know someone who did subscribe, because there are more stories like this one, and they deserve to be told while the people who live them are still here to tell them. Have you ever seen a steam traction engine running at full pressure? Leave it in the comments. I read every one. And the physics of 0 RPM torque and mechanical advantage is something every modern engineer still has to respect. That's the hidden truth we explore in the next story we're going to tell. The Case 110 doesn't plow the prairie anymore. It doesn't run the sawmill. Its primary work is done, but the fire isn't out. William keeps the brass polished. He keeps the gears heavily greased. He maintains his grandfather's boiler certification, passing the state inspections year after year, refusing to let the machine die a slow death of neglect. He knows what the wrecker operators learned that day in the mud. When everything goes wrong, when the modern safety nets fail, and when the earth decides to swallow your progress whole, you don't need a computer. You don't need more bank debt. You need a machine that doesn't know how to quit. The 1920 case is fully fueled. The bunker is stacked tight with high-grade coal. The water tank is topped off, and the massive cast iron gears are thickly coated in black grease. The traction engine is a towering, silent reminder that the earth does not care how much money you spent on your equipment or how sophisticated your hydraulics are. The earth only respects patience, mass, and the men who know how to use them. The commercial contractors will keep pushing the limits of the riverbanks. They will keep bringing heavier excavators, thicker nylon ropes, and larger municipal budgets. And eventually, the heavy rains will come again, the crust will break, and they will hit the absolute limit of what sudden force can accomplish. When they do, the old iron will be ready. Samuel Hightower's Case 110 is still sitting exactly where it belongs. William still walks out to the heavy timber shed every morning to check the locks. And every spring when the ground thaws and the yellow machinery rolls past the county line, the rusted black 1,920 steam engine is waiting in the dark. That's what happens when you build in silence while the world laughs.